saying one thing in public and then doing another thing behind closed doors.
Like the last guy.
I'm gonna
Right.
try. I'm gonna try going live again. Need
Okay.
to pull this, but I pulled it off and then put it back. I'm gonna try seeing if we're good now on YouTube. It should be, hopefully. But I also
Okay.
have a call from work that's on hold right now, so I'm gonna have to jump on that in a second anyway. But if we're live and we have sound, we should be okay.
We are. Yeah, we
Okay, it's echoing really bad for me, but it may not for you guys.
not echoing for me.
No echo for me either.
No, I mean it's echoing on the stream. I'm just gonna shut up anyway, so it doesn't matter. But it's not echoing for you guys, I don't think.
I don't hear it echoing on the stream. I think it's just you for. Okay. All right. So we are live now. All right. Hey, so anyway, we have James Black back as a guest. No intro because we had no intro music or anything like that because we haven't been streaming for a few weeks, so we had a bunch of technical issues. We tried to stream right at 6 o'clock, but we're having some issues. But want to thank you for coming on, James.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. So like one reason that I really wanted to put you on, I saw a post you had put on Facebook, and that's what kind of sparked my interest because you what was this during President Trump's inauguration speech? He said something like, "For now on, there will only be two genders" or something like that. And so, and you seem to kind of praise him for that. So, so I guess like I like to divide a question and might divide the conversation in like two parts. For one, I like to know like is something like that even appropriate for a president to say?
Yeah,
I mean, this seems like an odd position.
Yeah, for me, absolutely. I think he's drawing a huge contrast with his predecessor, and I think he's making it clear that eliminating a lot of this, what I feel in my heart to be gender madness and gender insanity, is helping the country move forward in a more healthy way. I think we're still going to have opportunity and a place in society for individuals who feel identifying as transgender is their way of life. But I feel like, that can be done in such a way that ideology and that philosophy doesn't interfere with the rest of society who, isn't a part of that.
Gotcha. You call it ideology and philosophy. When what do you think a trans person is?
I think a transgender person is someone who feels a sense of who is wrestling with what many psychologists would describe as gender dysphoria, which I don't have an exact definition for, but someone who feels attracted to something other than the biological body that they were given at birth.
Okay. So I think so this may be why you have a problem with I'm not gonna say trans people, but guess what the transgenderism, what you call a ideology or philosophy or something like that. Because you talked about attraction. Now being trans has nothing to do with your sexuality.
Right.
It's totally irrelevant. So you could be trans. Like I'm a male, my gender is male. Also my sex is male. I could still be attracted to men. Like it says nothing about my sexuality. And so it sounds like it's almost as if you think like a trans person is just a gay person. Like
no, it depends on the situation.
Okay. Gotcha. So I mean, well, do you think? I guess because you think you could elucidate on what a trans person is like? Well, what would it take to make me trans? Like, what properties would I need to be trans?
Basically, you would need to have an attraction to something else other than being what
women.
You would be a man being attracted to exactly what you just said.
So like, and that just fits my definition of gay. Or if I like both, then I'm just bi. right? So that's not necessarily trans to me. Matter of fact, I don't think like any trans person would say that. They would say that's just gay. Like, what do you think a gay person is then?
Okay, so let me go back and rephrase. I
Mhm.
think at the end of the day, um, a transgender person is someone who is wrestling with that concept of gender dysphoria that I just mentioned, and someone who identifies with a different gender than the one that they were assigned to at
Do
birth.
do you think you think sex and gender is the same thing?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so what is the sex?
A sex is either male or female. That sex is concrete. Whereas gender is how that gender can be. Let me look up a definition. Sorry, I want to be
Yeah,
more precise
yeah,
here.
yeah, that's fine.
I don't want to pull everything out of my head.
Hmm.
Um, this is from the Yale School of Medicine. Sex refers
Yep.
to a person's biological characteristics like chromosomes and reproductive organs, while gender refers to behaviors and identities associated with being male or female, which should be influenced by different things. I don't really. I will say that there are elements of this statement that I don't agree with, like saying that gender is a social construct. I don't necessarily believe that. But I think that sex
I,
is immutable in that way, whereas
I
gender
actually,
is
I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
no, no, that's fine. Whereas gender is an identity associated with being male or female.
I actually agree with you about gender not being a social construct. I don't think it is at all. I think gender is a biological construct. Like
Hmm.
it's not decided by society. It's decided by your biology. But
Yes.
but this your brain. So like for instance, like do you feel like a man?
Hmm.
Okay. So the reason you feel like a man is not because of your penis or because of your testicles. It's because of your brain. That's where
Hmm.
your identity is. So when we talk about gender identity, it's up here.
I would say that I also feel like I'm a man because of those other things, because without those things, I would not be a man. I wouldn't be able to, you
That would
know,
that wouldn't that fit the definition of sex you had described?
it does, but at the same time, if you don't have those things, you're just not a man. Like if you
So
don't
if you don't
have,
have a penis, you're not a man.
yes,
So like
but
if you got so what if you got castrated and the penis was removed too? Like what are you? Because you wouldn't have a vagina. You just have no sex.
what kind of examples of those kinds of people do we have living in society today? I'm not familiar with them, so I'm just curious as to what those
Well,
kinds of people would be.
I mean, I don't know anybody that has gotten their penis chopped off, but as far as being castrated, I mean, I don't know anybody personally, but I know they have existed, right? So, but like,
Hmm.
but if we're gonna let's say if we're gonna say that it's either male or female, and you're saying that if you don't have a penis, you're a male. If your penis is cut off, what are you?
Yeah, I honestly don't have an answer to that. I'll just be honest. And again, this is where my Christian faith informs a lot of what I believe. Obviously, we both come from a different perspective on that, and I think that's
Mhm.
great that we can have those conversations. But for me, that is just a big part of how God created the human race. It says in Genesis that, and again, different perspective on that, obviously.
But
Uh,
but if we're saying that's how God created him, and then we see with our own eyes that that's not necessarily the case, like can we still even say that? Like if we see trans people, then you can't say that that's how God created them unless God messed up somewhere.
well,
You know what I'm saying?
I don't think God created um, people who identify as transgender with the intent and purpose of them identifying that way. I think that is a choice based on a response to certain things that they're wrestling with. I know that there there's a lot of discussion about
Mm-hmm.
how a lot of people who have those attractions and have those feelings feel that it's not a choice. But I feel like at the end of the day, life is only 10% what happens to you, or how you're made, and 90% how you respond to it.
Do
I
you
just
think
want
could you choose to feel like a woman?
no.
Okay, so doesn't that contradict what you said earlier? You said that it's a
Well,
choice.
I could choose to become
You
more.
could choose to feel like a woman.
Let me go back and qualify that a little bit. I could choose in some ways to feel more effeminate and more effeminate. I could choose to get into certain things that women get into, like painting my nails and talking in a weird voice. And
Yeah, but that's
um,
not feeling like a woman, right? Like you could get your nails painted, you could put on woman's clothes, but would you really feel like a woman?
I would feel more effeminate if I did some of those things. Yes,
Yeah, but feeling more feminine is not necessarily feeling like a woman. Like for right now, like your gender identity is male, right?
correct.
Right. So could you choose to have a gender identity of a female? Could you choose to see yourself as a female? That's just the way you are.
I think that if I had the perspective that some of the people we're discussing have, then yes, I could choose to feel that way. But I'm not, because I believe God created me with a certain intention
Okay. So
to not
so
to not be that way.
so I when I talk about gender, because I think maybe there's a misunderstanding between terms here, because a lot of
Hmm.
like, because even earlier when I asked you to describe trans people, you were describing gay people, right? They mix in sexuality with trans, and that has nothing to do with that. It's
Hmm.
about identity. And so for me, a trans person is someone whose identity doesn't correspond to what usually maps to the specific biological sex. So like usually
Right.
if you're masculine, your biological sex tends to be male. That's usually the way it happens. It doesn't
Hmm.
always have to be that case. And when it's not, that's when I call somebody trans. And so like so right now, there's this is actually this experiment that I refer to a lot when
Interesting.
I have this conversation with people about trans stuff. And so it's this they have this machine. It's not a language learner model, but it's a form of AI that can make inferences based off of information being presented to it. And so
Hmm.
what they had was they had men and women of very similar aptitude and intellectual talents and have them solve
Hmm.
a problem. And this machine could detect with about 93% accuracy whether you're male or female
Hmm.
just by looking at what your brain did when you solve a problem. They will,
Interesting.
yeah, they will look at just like the neural pathways, and it would look at the brain, the neural pathways that's going on in the brain when it's solving a problem, and it says the brain did this, that's a male. The brain did this, female, and it was like 93% accuracy.
Hmm.
What they noticed is with some people, they have a biological male solve a problem like a Rubik's cube or something. They just think through the
Hmm.
problem, and their brain would form pathways that would be indicative of a woman. Those people tended to be trans. Now think about some of the things that trans people say. They say like, I feel like a man in a woman's body or a woman in a man's body. Now, from what
Hmm.
I just described in that experiment, that's a pretty damn good description of what's going on, isn't it? Imagine if
Hmm.
you had a brain that you were in your body, you had a brain that formed neurological pathways indicative
Hmm.
of a woman.
Hmm.
You now think about that. So you essentially have a woman's brain in a man's body.
Hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Hmm. Yeah.
That
Um,
would be a trans person.
hmm.
So
Um,
isn't go ahead.
After the show, I would love to dig into that study or the AI experiment you just mentioned a bit further. So please feel free to send me that link.
Yeah, sure.
I would love to dig into that a little more for sure, because first time hearing about that particular study.
Yeah. So well, let's say based off of what I described to you, like now, what would you say about trans people? Because like you're not now when you solve a problem, you don't choose what your brain does while you're solving a problem. Like when you're thinking, somebody presents a math equation to you, and you're just thinking, right? You don't choose the neurological paths that is being formed while you're thinking through the problem, right?
Right, right. This
So
go ahead.
I was gonna say, so based off of that, it would seem to be absurd, in my opinion, to suggest that a person is choosing to be trans. It's equivalent to saying they choose to have a brain that forms neurological pathways in this particular pattern,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't. Go ahead.
There's an interesting definition about gender identity from the American Psychological Association. Gender
Mhm.
identity refers to a person's internal sense of being male or female or something else. It is distinct from sex or gender. And
Mhm.
so, in the context of the conversation that we're having, people are created and wired a certain way, but they can still choose. They can choose to follow that, or they can choose to go in a different direction.
So
And
when you say follow that, what you mean by that? So let's say I have this body, and my brain forms neurological pathways that would be indicative of a woman. Well, how would I choose to follow that?
well, by responding to any kind of stimuli that you might be experiencing, like people might have that sense of attraction. They might have it from birth, but they
But
ultimately,
remember, hold on, remember. So being transgender has nothing to do with your sexual attraction. Like sexuality has nothing to do with it. What you're describing is a gay person, not a trans person. Because
but aren't
go ahead.
aren't people who identify as transgender, aren't they still attracted to that which is not their natural birth?
Not necessarily. They may or may not. Like it's totally irrelevant. Like I could be trans and attracted to men, or attracted to women, or attracted to both.
They
Like
could be
because
okay.
like thinking about this, like so I have a daughter. She's 4 years old. I would argue that right now she has no sexuality. Like she doesn't seem to like boys or girls. She's just a kid. She likes to play with things and have fun and play in the mud and stuff. Like I would say right now she is asexual. She has no sexual preference. What is her gender identity? She's a girl. She's a hardcore girl. You see what I'm saying? So, by your logic, she wouldn't be a girl because she has no sexual orientation. We talk about a baby, like an infant, right? Obviously, the infant has no sexual orientation, but we would still call it a girl. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So you see how like they're separate and distinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
I got you for sure.
yeah.
I do think though that there is a difference between gender and gender identity, and I feel like that a person is born with a certain gender, and that is their gender, and it's either male or female, and people can pursue a gender identity that is what they feel led to do. But at the end of the day, just coming from the faith that I have, I think
Mhm.
that there's only two genders, and you know, I don't want to divert from the question you just asked, but I agree with what President Trump did in that situation because
Mhm.
that's just what my faith
Does
informs me.
but doesn't what Trump said, doesn't that sound unscientific from like what I just described to you? Like I'll say
Not ne-
you haven't seen the studies yet. I'll send them to you. And there's
yeah.
actually like several dozen of them. This wasn't done just one time.
Hmm.
This was done several times. And it seems like to me, based off of what the data that we have available to us, that is a unscientific position.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's other data available that would present a different picture. I don't have
Like
that,
what?
but
Okay.
um, I don't have it in front of me right now. But this is something that I'd love to continue. Obviously, I want to fit as much as we can into this episode, but um, I feel like science that's never questioned can't really be trusted. So I feel like one study might paint one picture, but another study might paint another, and we kind of have
Well,
to
that's the
bring both
thing.
of them,
That's what I was saying.
together.
So this specific study was done this experiment was done several dozen times, saying if they could replicate the results, and they were. So it was doing it. So like it's not what I'm giving to you isn't something that can't be questioned.
Right.
So this was done over and over again. And this wasn't even done to try to validate or invalidate the beliefs of trans people. Like this was irrelevant. Well, what they were trying to do is see if there were differences and between male and female brains, and physically, like geometrically, they're about the same. There was just like small differences about the size of a grain of rice as far as like the type of brain matter that was there. But when they started working, it started forming pathways to solve things. Their brains did very different things. You know, there's, like I said, this isn't something that can't be questioned. What I'm giving you is just science. The same science that was used for the setup, the IT systems that we're communicating
on. Yeah, I think that's really great that study was able to be replicated and generalized to other studies. I think that's really good that the scientists had that approach, that they were open to revision and more information, for sure. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that science might tell us that a male could have elements of their personality, that they're they have an interest in female things, or females might have an interest in male things. Not talking about sexuality, but they might be gender curious. I think that people could be gender curious, which again, that's not an approach that I agree with. As a Christian, I believe that if you're born a male, that's who you're called to be, and if you're born a female,
why do you think God would give them a brain that operates like a female if he wanted them to be a male?
I think a lot of these things are a product of the fall, and God uses them for a greater purpose that we can't know or ascertain.
So by that logic, would you at least grant the existence of trans people? Because whether they by the fall or sin or whatever,
I think
trans people are real.
Yeah. I'm not saying that people who identify as transgender are not real at all. I think they're very real people. I think they're children of God, and that he wishes for them to be redeemed and have a different perspective one day. Where I would disagree is I think that is specifically a gender identity. I don't think that people are born transgender. I think that people are born and then they choose through their gender identity to identify as a transgender person.
Well, but what about the experiment that I said? They even evolved it in children, right? So you could take a toddler, hook them up to this machine, and just give them a toy, give them a Rubik's cube, or that's too complicated, but like it's just something simple, and have them try to solve the problem. And his brain is going to do things that are indicative of that gender. So, so this isn't even about how one identifies. I could bring you into a room. You tell me nothing about your gender identity, and I could determine whether you're trans just based off your physical biology and the test results of your brain scan. I mean, there is something empirically going on that I can that I can observe. So this isn't a feeling in their head, right? It's like saying like this is just a feeling that they have. It's like saying that a heart attack is just a feeling in your chest. There's an objective empirical phenomenon that is happening,
right?
And you would still say that person is just choosing to be that way.
I would, yes. I would say that just because you're disposed to be a certain way does not mean you are that thing. You can still decide, okay, I want to go along in this direction.
So when a person says they're trans, what do you think they're saying? So like if I were to say I'm trans, and what do you think I'm saying?
You're describing your gender identity. There's only male or female, but your gender identity is that of a transgender person.
Okay, and would you say that I'm wrong when I describe myself that way?
I would say yes, from the standpoint that that's not what God intended for you to be.
Okay, but from the perspective of reality, as in there's an actual thing that's happening in my brain, and the way I feel is just a manifestation of that brain. So let's just put God on the side for a second. Let's just talk about reality, what actually is. My brain is doing it, is operating as if it's a female, and I feel like a female as a result of that because that's what my brain is doing. You're saying I'm wrong.
So again, we obviously have two completely different worldviews, and I will always respect that. I can't separate God from reality. For me,
Mm-hmm.
that is reality, and that is just, I can't remove Christianity or God from any issue or topic that I discuss.
Okay,
So
let's keep God into it. So, but regardless, my brain is doing an actual thing, and then the way I feel is just a manifestation of what's going on in my brain. And you're saying I'm wrong. Like right now, I feel like a man because that's the way my brain operates.
does feelings determine like who we are? Or is there something more? I would argue that there's something more. I would argue that how we feel is like one piece of the pie, and that,
Yeah.
that there's
So if we're talking about gender identity, then the way you feel is going to be like the whole chunk. But like obviously, I'm more than what I just feel, right? So like I'm bald. The way I feel is regardless. It doesn't matter, right? I'm black. The way I feel doesn't matter,
Mhm.
right? If we're talking about gender identity, then it's going to be it's about what's going on up here psychologically, and the way I
Mhm.
feel is just a manifestation of that. So that would be the reality because that's what we're talking about.
I just feel like there's more to reality than, okay, I feel a certain way, therefore I must be this. I feel like, like what I feel like your role in society, how you were made physically. I feel like there's more to, who a person is called to be than just, how I'm feeling at the moment.
Sure, but I'm not talking about all the reality of who a person's called to be. We're talking about specifically is your gender identity. Can a person be wrong about how they identify? So the person feels a certain way because of what's going on in their brain, and they're just saying that they feel that way. Are they wrong?
Sure, because we're imperfect humans. It's, I'm not gonna ever
Mhm.
go up to, a person who's identifying as transgender and tell them that. Everybody has the
Yeah,
choice
for
to.
God. So, all right. So you're saying so their brain operates like a woman, and as a result, they feel like a woman. And you're saying you're wrong for having a feeling that's just an extension of what your brain is doing. You're saying that that's just wrong.
Because they were born a man. If they weren't born a man, then there'd be no issue.
So,
But
but
they weren't.
that you're describing biological sex.
But
You're
still,
not describing gender identity.
a person's gender comes from their biology. It's not a subjective thing. It's
Yeah,
not a subjective.
I haven't said that at all. Yeah, it is definitely not subjective. It is definitely coming from their biology. Their
Right.
brain is a manifestation of that, and it's
Right.
just as real. I was also argue their brain is a much more intimate part of who they are than their penis ever will be. You chop off my penis or deform it or whatever. I'm still me. I still know all the stuff that I know. I still have my preference, my opinions, and all that kind of stuff. You do that to my brain, you're gonna deal with a very different person.
Although, for example, in the case of a man, that person wouldn't be able to have sex in the same way. They wouldn't be able to be a father in the same way. They wouldn't
Yeah,
be,
but
be
but
able
you're
to have.
not.
But they
Yeah,
would be the same person, and they could still actually experience those same attractions.
Yeah, yeah, I would concede that their experience would be fundamentally different, but they would still in a way be the same person.
but okay, would you argue that your brain is a much more intimate part of who you are than your genitals?
Yeah.
So if you're a woman, so if your brain is telling you you're a woman, you're more of a woman than you are not, right? Because that's a more intimate part of you.
I guess
That's coming straight from your brain, and you're like, no, your penis is this, so you're that.
I would just question, like, digging further into that study, why is this person's brain telling them to be a woman, or why is this person's brain telling them to be a man? What are the specific hormones and signals that are being sent that are determining that, and kind of, unpacking that a bit more.
Their biology. That's why. It's because of their biology. That's what's going on there.
So what in their biology would cause them to, is that referring to the neurological pathway experiment you were describing?
Yes. Yep. Like all of the organs of your body, like form a certain way because of your DNA, and that's who you are.
Yeah.
So it ultimately is their biology.
Yeah. I obviously don't believe that, but
why? What about the experiments that I gave you? What about, the argument that I just made? Like, these are things that you agreed with, because it seemed like you agreed with all my premises that logically follow, but then you're rejecting the conclusion. Like you're agreeing that your brain is a manifestation of your biology. You're agreeing that your brain is a more intimate part of you than your genitals are. And now when we get to the point of your brain telling you what you are, and you're saying the brain is just wrong.
Yeah, I just don't think that there's ever I think there's more to the picture. I think that when people do go through those struggles that they have that are a part of gender dysphoria, that as they grow and mature, they will find that one day their brain isn't giving them those signals, and that they can reach a point in their life when there's no more gender confusion.
But I mean, we have pretty in-depth studies of people that have transitioned for trans people, and the majority of them overwhelmingly say they feel more confident when they're accepted as who they identify as. It's an overwhelmingly positive experience for those people. Now, admittedly, there are cases where people have changed their mind. There are people that say that they wish they hadn't transitioned. There are people that are flat out rejected by their community and their friends and family, and that undoubtedly contributes to their feeling of acceptance and feeling of, I guess even self-worth and identity. But we have study after study showing people that if they truly are identifying as a female because their brain is making those paths for them, and they transition from male to female or female to male, vice versa, in either case, an overwhelming response of people who do that say it's a positive experience for them. So when you say that eventually it's going to work itself out, what you're saying is those people are just wrong or lying.
Well, they're not staying true to who they were, in my view, and who they were originally created to be. Obviously, we both have different worldviews on that, but I looked at the stories of people like
what height you are now?
Like Chloe Cole, who were basically fed into these, gender affirming programs, and they suffered tremendous psychological distress, and they regretted it because they were pushed into those programs by other people. They didn't necessarily make those choices totally independently of.
Well, that's completely different. If someone's forcing you into a program, especially it force you into a trans program and you're not trans, that's going to be traumatizing. That'd be like it's like sending me, like, I'm not gay and you send me to a place that forces me to be gay. Yeah, that's going to be traumatizing, and so not for that at all. So would you agree that in like manner, taking a trans person and sending him to a camp to try to force him to not be trans, wouldn't that be equally as problematic?
Yeah, if they were forced into it, for sure, because everyone should have the right to choose, at least in the context of this life. I believe that when we get to the next life, there won't be a choice, but that's a conversation for another different subject.
Can I ask a seemingly unrelated question?
Good.
Do you brush your teeth?
Yes.
Why?
Because I want to be presentable, and I want to keep good hygiene.
But don't you think that you were made with good teeth that are
Mm,
presentable?
just like a car, if you don't keep the vehicle up, if you don't take care of himself, it'll eventually fall into ruin. So you might be given a good product, but you've got to maintain it.
So, in a situation in which someone has teeth, they should try to maintain them for what purpose? Why wouldn't your God design them to be last your whole life without any effort or maintaining?
Because as a part of following, what God wants for us to do, we have to take good care of creation, including our own. It's not just, perfect and immaculate. We have to respond, and be good stewards of what God has
So what
given to
you're
us.
saying
And
is
and
God
even
didn't make things
go ahead.
perfect, so it's okay for people to do things to maintain themselves.
Yes, as long as it's in accordance with who they were created to be. If it's not in
Well, you weren't
accordance with
created
who
to
they
be a
were,
person with perfect teeth or even good teeth. You were created as a person without teeth, as a matter of fact.
sorry, I'm not following.
Well, you didn't have teeth, and you have teeth now. You were created without teeth. So what you're doing is you're saying that God didn't create you the way that you are now.
But that's actually not accurate. We are created with teeth. Just because they don't grow at
Nope.
the time we're born doesn't
Your
mean that
teeth
we weren't
develop.
created to have them.
Just like testes develop and ovaries develop. You're not created with them.
We're
You don't come out of the womb
we're
with them.
created
You
with
don't
the
go into the
intention that
womb with
those
them.
things will develop in time.
And then they will fall out if you don't do something about it, which is natural.
Correct.
So why not just let it be a natural thing if that's what God intended?
Right, but identifying with a different gender other than the birth certificate, other than the gender that's on your birth certificate, is not natural. That's why we
In the
have
sense
gender.
that this brain tells you you are a gender, and you're identifying that way, correct?
I'm saying that's not natural.
What's
That process
unnatural about the
of
brain telling you what gender you are? Doesn't it do that for you?
your brain telling you a gender that's different than the one you were born with is not natural. Correct. That may be happening and it may be occurring, but it's not natural. It's not normal.
So, for instance, do you have a sexual preference of body types you like?
Yeah, I think everybody does, right?
Oh, okay. So, but did you sit down and determine what those were going to be one day?
They were shaped through time over experiences that I've had throughout my life.
But there was
They didn't.
never a set point in time where you were like, I'm going to grow up to like people with brunette hair. Like that's who I'm going to be in the future. That just
No,
developed on its own over time.
no, it was shaped through time over experiences.
Right. So like your brain tells you over time with experience the preferences that you have and the feelings that you're going to experience.
Right.
And that's natural. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference in that and a brain telling you that you're a different gender identity? Because that's also the natural process. You literally just have different pathways forming in this neuro fashion, which says these are the way that your brain interprets things, just like your brain prefers a particular hair type or body type or whatever, coffee flavor or ice cream flavor. Like you have these things that have developed over time. You never once sat down and said, I'm going to like vanilla ice cream and nothing else, and that's the way it's going to be. What ended up happening is your brain developed pathways that determined what your favorite flavor of ice cream is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the difference between those situations is that the lights we have, the sexual preferences we have, the shaping of those things over time is subjective and determined by a lot of different factors. Yes, it's determined by our brain, but it's also determined by our environment, the whole kind of nature versus nurture conversation. Whereas our
That
gender,
doesn't seem to, but like the scientific studies that I've seen doesn't really seem to back that up. Like you take a child and he's raised by gay couples. They're not gay. Children born in born to or raised by homosexual couples have the same chances of being homosexual themselves as one raised by heterosexuals. Like it seems like you're suggesting, you said nature and nurture, as if if a child has two dads, then that child is more likely to be gay.
Well,
and the studies I've seen don't back that up.
Interesting. You don't think necessarily that being raised in a household with two dads would make them more, maybe more interested and more curious about adopting that lifestyle for themselves?
The science doesn't seem to back that up. I mean, if you were to just surround me by a bunch of gay men, that's not going to make me start to be attracted to them. I don't see how
the occupation of your parents.
Say it again.
Can I ask the occupation of either of your parents?
So my stepdad is, they're both retired, but my stepdad was an engineer. Sorry.
Are you an engineer now?
He was an engineer when he was an engineer for 20 years. And then my mom was a teacher, and both of them are retired. They live in Pennsylvania right now.
Are you an engineer?
Biological dad was a photographer. Sorry, go ahead.
Are you an engineer now?
No.
Do you take a large fascination in engineering?
I do. I enjoy a lot of things about engineering. I enjoy how roller coasters are built. I enjoy how buildings were built. I'm fascinated by what happened last night with the tragic airline accident.
So what you're saying is it's possible to grow up under the influence of an engineer and to have influence by an engineer and to learn about things of engineering and not turn out to be an engineer.
Right, because we have a choice, we have agency. Just because we're raised a certain way doesn't mean we will go, follow the exact same
because
mentality
your brain doesn't adopt those pathways, right? Like you didn't settle on that.
I think there's more to it than that. I think we also respond and reinforce that development. I feel like
did your stepdad reinforce the development of you becoming an engineer?
Yeah, because I chose to.
But you're not one.
Research certain activities. But here's an interesting study about nature versus nurture. This is from the National Library of Medicine, so this is not a political source by any means. Yeah. It says nature versus nurture is one of the oldest questions in science. The answer is not an either or, but rather it is both nature and nurture acting in various degrees. As summarized below in greater detail, many workshop participants chose to highlight the nature versus nurture question as one of the grand challenges of the field, but in doing so, they put a twist on the question. How does the interplay of biology and experience shape our brains and make us who we are?
Well, so I wasn't saying nature and I wasn't saying nature and nurture isn't a thing. Sure, the way you're nurtured does affect who you are. What I was rejecting was that it can have an effect on your sexuality or your gender identity. That doesn't seem to be backed up by the science that I've seen. So there could be nurture that, for instance, both Facade and I were born and raised with Christian worldview because both of our parents were adamant churchgoers. Mine were preachers, right? And so nurture has a huge effect on that, but it didn't make me heterosexual,
right?
That was and if I was gay, my parents wouldn't have anything to do with that either. That's from what I've seen in the science, that it just doesn't seem to be backed up by that. And so I haven't looked at it as far as gender identity, but just from my understanding of how it worked, when you're talking about neurological pathways being formed, I don't see how the nurture would affect that, whether you have a trans child or not. Because from what I could see, that seems to be equal opportunity. Trans children seem to be popping up in liberal and conservative households alike, which kind of puts a huge hole in this idea that it's the liberal left is forcing transgender ideology on children. Because if that was the case, you would expect to see way more trans children in liberal households, and you don't. It seems to be happening equally, like everywhere.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, a lot of it is through these gender affirming care programs. And at first it seemed like there were some studies, some Dutch studies that were supporting the gender affirming model. But as time has gone on, and I do have another one pulled up here, those studies have since been challenged. And this is another one from the National Library of Medicine, basically asserting that the gender affirming model of care is incompatible with competent ethical medical practices. And what it says is that the gender affirming model of care substitutes the political role of expanding personal liberty for the evidence-based medicine processes of clinical reasoning, rendering them incompatible with competent ethical medical practice. And we've seen these not just in America, but abroad in the UK with the closure of the Tavistock clinic. You guys probably both were aware of that.
Oh yeah, they were practicing pseudoscience. So that clinic that you're talking about, the one in UK that got shut down, there was a lot of things that they were doing wrong. They should have in fact been shut down. But we're talking about gender affirming care, like it in its entirety. That's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, like, so tell me what do you think gender affirming care is?
Gender affirming care is the moment someone expresses even the slightest symptom or slightest inclination of something that I would call as a symptom of gender dysphoria. They're immediately pushed into these gender affirming care programs, and they're immediately pushed into adopting a transgender gender identity. When what they really need is psychotherapy.
No, but that's not what transgender. That's not what gender affirming care is at all. So I can tell you, like, the first steps that they go through is like it's just counseling, and they want to find out who they are. So when a child says, "I think I'm trans," or a little girl says, "Hey, I think I feel like a little boy," they're asking, why do you feel like that way? And they're asking them a bunch of different questions. They're trying to figure out where they are and how long it's going to stay like that. Because a lot of times some of the what you call the gender dysphoria, a lot of times it tends to go away. So they're trying to weed those out. And they're really good at them. They're really good at that. And we know that they're really good at that because the rate of detransitioning is just so damn low. It is about 3%. And then the majority of that 3%, the reason they detransition has nothing to do with no longer being transgender. It's because of finances. It's the number one reason. We need to really fix our healthcare system because insurance is just not good at helping out with that. And so a lot of times they run out of money before they completely transition. Lifetime commitment. And another thing is just the stigma that they face and socially as a result of it. So it's a really small percentage. That's how we know that we're really good at figuring out whether this gender dysphoria is something that's permanent or if it is just some transient thing that the child is going through. But they're not trying to sway the kid one way or the other. If they were, we would be seeing really high detransition rates. Kind of like these in those anti-gay camps that a lot of the Christians were doing. They were sending kids to these gay camps to make them straight.
The conversion therapy.
Yeah, and it just wasn't working. You were saying in grows, they would just turn back gay. You know why? Because they were doing the exact same thing that you were saying the gender affirming care does. They were trying to force a certain ideology on them based on their worldview. And we saw the results of that. It just didn't work. So the real ideology, the real pseudoscience is actually coming from the religious right, who's saying you're not who you are, you're not what your brain is, you're what my book says or what my God says you are, or whatever their belief system is. And you can see that coming out in the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's a New York Times article. I'm just browsing through stuff, so I'll have stuff to talk about with you guys. There's an interesting article in the New York Times. This was, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. It's an op-ed, but the title is, "As kids, they thought they were trans, they no longer do." There's a case of a woman named Stephanie Wynn, who's a licensed. She was a marriage and family therapist, but she was trained in gender-affirming care and treated multiple transgender patients, the article says. But in 2020, after coming across videos of people detransitioning, she began to question the gender affirming model and spoke out in favor of approaching gender dysphoria in a more considered way. But then she was, after she adopted that position, and she was wanting to give care to people who were no longer considering
But
themselves transgender.
do you remember what I was saying? Or like, remember what I said, like just maybe like just about a minute ago? How in most cases where we see gender dysphoria in children, for the majority of times it goes away, and that just shows you the level of expertise that these clinicians have at
Right.
weeding it out. Okay, so when they weed out people who aren't really trans, that's not an argument against trans people.
Mm-hmm.
That's just you determining who's trans and who isn't. Just like if we bring in 1,000 people and everybody thought they had cancer, and then we scanned them and we find out that 900 of them don't actually have cancer. That's not an argument that cancer doesn't exist. That proves my expertise in actually identifying cancer. You see what I'm saying? So like, because that article you was reading, they were saying, oh yeah, the kids thought they were trans and they actually weren't. Yeah, that happens, but that's not an argument against trans kids.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it goes on. It says many parents believed their kids were gay or dealing with complicated issues, but all said they felt compelled by gender clinicians, doctors, schools, and social pressure to accede to their child's declared gender identity, even if they had serious doubts. So it may be that some people who are gender clinicians are doing things the way you've described, but it seems like some are involved in a little bit of a pressure campaign.
Some are, and they usually get
like,
shut down, just like the
get me
example
wrong
you
here.
talked about in the UK.
Yeah, don't get this wrong here, James. We're not saying that doesn't exist or it doesn't happen. We're saying that as science develops, I think we're going to see at least from the two people that you're talking with here, if we get better at something or we understand it better, we're going to take the better approach as we get better. 100 years ago, doing knee surgery was deadly. Science has improved a lot since then. We're better at it.
Thank goodness.
We don't take. I mean, like now, I know I personally have met a doctor because I had surgery from a guy who did 35 knee replacements a month. Doesn't kill people. It's great. We've come a long way since then. And as science develops and as we develop science on the brain and how it develops and the pathways to develop, we're going to continue to support the science and the development behind it. And sounds, and I'm not trying to accuse you of anything here, but what it sounds like we're doing is we're taking this article of this doctor or this clinician that no longer does this because she saw some negative results from it and saying, okay, well now we can throw out all the positive results because there's this one doctor who came out and said XYZ, right? Well, what you're ignoring is all the other people that didn't. Like AAA pointed out earlier, 3%. Like less than 3% transition. So out of 100 people, we got less than 3 wrong. And what we're saying is, and there's 97%, and the 97 out of 100, we got that right. And we're getting better, by the way. Like we're getting better over time. We're understanding it better over time. And if by any means, if anyone is forcing an ideology upon someone else, be it about gender identity or about religion, and you're not allowing that person to think for themselves, I am opposed to it. So if you're forcing the idea of being trans upon a child, I'm opposed to that idea. However, if you're an avid scientist and you're doing active steps to help someone explore who they are and how their
Mhm.
brain tells them what they are. And that person then identifies as a sex, or sorry, as a gender of a person that is not the sex they were born as. And they are allowed to explore that. And they are given care to treat that. And they identify as a gender that is not associated with the sex they're born as. And in 97% of the time, that is a correct diagnosis. We're doing really well. The mortality
Yeah.
rate for simple surgery 100 years ago was incredible. As science progressed, we got much better at it. Now you don't go into surgery with a 50-50 chance that you're going to die over something like having a finger amputated.
Mhm.
You know, like, and as we get better and the science progresses, we get better at how we treat these things. We're not saying that it's perfect, and we're not saying that people don't regret it or that people got it wrong. We're just saying that in the cases that we get it right, which we're really good at already and we're getting better, the science seems to be on our side, right? Or would you disagree?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that it's great when we always have more information brought into science, and I totally agree with that approach for sure. Where we're constantly updating what we know based on new information that's coming in. As I'm looking, I am seeing some studies that has the detransition rate as high as 13%, which obviously that's still the extreme minority, but perhaps in some cases a bit more pronounced. I totally want to, I totally support any type of scientific approach that gives these individuals support and treatment and guidance and allows them to live a better quality of life. I just do not believe that identifying with a different gender than the one they were born with will ultimately lead to that better quality of life.
What if there was science backed up that shows us exactly what happened, how depression actually went down as a result of that? That
So
they were feeling happier.
So they were depressed because of the gender dysphoria they initially had.
So usually that's not what leads to the depression. It's usually the way they're treated by society and especially their family. That's far more important. Because even like if you look at, like, for instance, I hear it pointed out how the depression rate among trans people is even higher than of blacks during the Jim Crow era, because blacks was another group that was also like marginalized. But the marginalization of trans people is very different from what blacks went through. Like, for instance, like let's say I was born, let's say it was 1940s and I'm walking around, right? And so sure, I'm in the South and most of white people down there hate me for whatever reason, but my family loves me. My dad loves me, my mom loves me, my aunts and uncles, and all that kind of stuff. And that's very different from what's happening with trans people. They're being marginalized, not just by society, but by their family, the ones who love them the most. That seems to be what's leading to the depression. Because what we see after transition, if they're accepted by their parents, then their the suicide rate is about equal to cisgender children.
Mm-hmm. Well, they should be accepted by their parents. They should be
not accepted by their parents as in, I accept you as a boy because that's the way you was born. No, I'm talking about as in affirming their actual gender identity. Then their depression rate tends to go down to about the same as cisgender children.
Yeah, obviously I wouldn't fully agree with that approach, but I would say, accept and love this person.
Agree or not, you're saying that it's not going to lead to happiness. And what I'm saying is the science shows that it does. It actually leads to better mental health.
Mm-hmm. I look forward to continuing to investigate the studies that show that.
Okay, I can send those to you.
Yeah. I look forward to
I may have
reading
missed it
them.
because I was mindfully absent, and I apologize at the beginning of this call because I had a work issue to deal with. But
Mhm.
uh, given the topic and the title, you may have discussed it already, but did we talk about the executive order that Trump signed and what that means, scientifically at
Uh,
least?
no, we did. We talked about what he said during his inauguration
Okay,
speech, but
well,
that's it.
do either of you have a opinion on the executive order sign that says that male and how male and female are defined?
No, I don't.
Did you get
But
to
I'm
either of you get to
I
read
didn't.
that?
I'm probably going to disagree with it. Tell me though,
So it says
James man.
at the time of conception, male should be the producer of the smaller chromosome, and female would be the producer of the larger chromosome. Do you agree with that definition of male and female, James?
What's the name of the executive order again? Just so I
Oh man,
can
I don't know. He
go through.
signed over 200. Let me look.
I'm just googling it right now. Defending women and gender ideology. Sex shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. Sex is not a synonym for and does not include the concept of gender identity. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Woman and women. Okay, I mean,
That's Executive Order 14168.
okay, so female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces large reproductive cell.
Mm-hmm.
Male means a person belonging at the conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that definition?
You agree with that?
I agree with that. Yeah.
Are you aware at the time of conception that you don't produce either?
No, I was not. I was not aware of that.
Oh, so what do you call them then? Because you're not either gender according to that executive order. Because at the time of conception, you don't produce either the small nor large hormone. Because your sexual organs don't develop until much later. And then, even so, you don't start developing what we call the gamete in the scientific community until puberty, which is typically around the age of 10 in girls and 12 or so in boys, sometimes a little later or earlier, depending on the hormonal balance of that person. But at the time of conception, you're still years and years away from that being a problem.
Just like with the teeth metaphor and the other metaphors we were discussing, each unborn fetus is created with the intention that they are ultimately going to develop those things. So even though they may not technically have those
Nope,
things
that's
at the
also
moment.
incorrect. When the sperm and the egg join together to form an embryo, you are a woman. That is how you were intended to be. It's not until a little later in which you start developing the genes for becoming a male, actually. Everyone at conception is a woman, biologically.
Why? Could you expound upon why that is?
Well, because male reproductive genes don't develop until later than at the point of conception. So at the point of conception, there is no such thing as male. Everyone is a female. Yeah, that's genuinely a thing. You can Google this, like it is scientifically backed across the board for humans. At the time of conception, there is no possibility of you being a male. There is only the possibility of you being a female, the standard, actually, XX. XY is actually a chromosomal imbalance that doesn't happen until later in development.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it applies to all mammals.
Yep, this is 100% true across the board. There is some exceptions in reptiles, actually, but that doesn't account for most mammals. So, you're either female at birth, according to or at conception, or you're non-gender at conception if you're talking about gamete production. But either way, according to the executive order, you're either no sex or female. Do you still agree with that definition?
According to the EO, everybody's female then.
Yeah, that's correct. According to the executive order, either everyone is female or you're non-sexual. Because you don't have a sex, because you don't produce gametes. If you're using gametes as large chromosome, you don't start producing gametes until you're of reproductive age. And if you're not talking about that, what you're talking about is the like actual sexual chromosomes, which are XX at the time of conception for every mammal ever.
So, at what point in the fetus's development are those chromosomes fully developed?
Well, again, are we talking about
it's
sexual
later,
chromosomes?
early on in the development it shows, but at conception, which is the wording that's used in
In the
the
executive
EO,
order.
that is the problem.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's why I was asking if you
at
agreed with that
conception,
definition.
you
Yeah.
weren't James, you were Jamesette at conception.
Something fun to think about.
Yeah, I was Jocelyn.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still are
I
actually,
did-
because if it's at the time of conception, you don't get to change that, right?
yeah. Lots of really interesting things to contemplate and
Yeah.
think about.
You know what we
I
should
get
do? Maybe instead
Go
of
ahead.
asking a president his opinion on how sex should work, maybe ask the science, because that's not how we would define it that way.
Hmm. Like how many weeks into
Does the executive order specify how many weeks
Well,
they need to be?
let's say it was 30 minutes after conception, you turn into whatever sex you're going to be.
Which is
It wouldn't matter because it says conception, which is like doesn't seem to be that way. But let's say it was 30 minutes after. At conception, you're a female. So that is the terminology used in the EO. So
Mhm.
I didn't know that.
yeah, I thought that was a fun
that's
fact.
Yeah, interesting. What James? What do you think about like men who have gotten pregnant and then given birth, like men who have XY chromosomes and gotten pregnant and given birth? What do you think about that?
Can I just go back and can I read one thing real quick before I respond to your next question? This is from the Mayo Clinic. It says a fetus has chromosomes immediately after conception when the sperm and egg to form a zygote, which contains the full 46 chromosomes, 23 from the mother and 23 from the father. So if that's correct, then I do agree with the executive order.
But those chromosomes are XX in every case of mammals. That's the point. Like your chromosomes at conception are XX. Well, we're not saying you don't have chromosomes. If you lack a chromosome, that's called Down syndrome, right? And if you have an extra one, I forget what it's called. Something. It's a really fancy term. I didn't mean to like marginalize or like discriminate against those people. I just don't know the term for having an additional chromosome at the moment. It'll come back in a minute. But yeah, like there's a scientific definition for lacking chromosomes or having additional chromosomes as well. We're not saying that. We're just saying that at the time of conception, your 23rd chromosome paired is always XX in mammals.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change, and it's called pathogenesis, in which you start to develop testes. That is the first indication that you're going to be a male, and that doesn't happen until weeks after pregnancy. I'm trying to see an exact time in which we start to see development of the testes in the human development, but according to the executive order, at the time of conception, you're a female.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Even if it's 10 minutes afterwards, it doesn't matter.
It's definitely not. It's literally weeks and weeks before we start to determine this, but like, yeah, according to the EO, at least, everyone is born female.
Well, but my other question, so James, look, what do you think about like biological men being able to give birth?
I don't think that those are biological men. I think they're women.
Okay, even you have XY chromosomes.
You
have XY chromosomes. What chromosomes do men have?
That's why.
Okay, so a person with XY chromosomes give birth. So you still say that's a woman?
So how are they quote unquote giving birth? Are they giving birth through a vagina?
Yeah.
Then they're women.
Okay, so even though the chromosomes are XY.
Correct.
Okay, so it's because they have a vagina.
Correct. I believe
what if they have a penis and a vagina?
I don't even know how I would respond to that, to be honest. I would say that.
Yeah, do people like that exist?
Right. Right. I'm not denying that. I'm saying that I would encourage those people to seek professional help through a therapist.
Sure. Maybe They may or may not need to
Also
seek
maybe
professional
lockdown,
help.
but-
But regardless, there would they have to be either a man or a woman, right?
Right.
So which one are they? Because this doesn't seem to be a problem. That's not a problem for biology. This is a problem with your model, with the model of how you're framing sex and gender here. It doesn't seem to fit reality.
The person who has both, I don't know. Like, I don't know what gender they would be.
But your model can't determine that. So isn't that a problem with your model? If your model can't fit reality, you need to change the model, not pretend that reality is something else, right?
Yeah, not necessarily. You're either born a man or you're born a woman. So,
Or you could be born something else that your model can't identify, because you were saying if you have a vagina, you're a woman, even if you have XY chromosomes for some reason. But let's say you have a vagina, even though in science, that's not how they determine what a man or a woman is. They use the gamete, not a vagina. But let's say they have a vagina, they have a penis, and your model can't describe what they are. Doesn't that point out a problem with your model?
but it's not a model. It's the reality by which God.
But it's not the reality. But because we see, you're saying everybody's either a man or a woman. You, by your own definition, a person is a woman if they have a vagina. Now I'm giving you an example of a person with a penis and a vagina.
So in
reality, your model fails here. And apparently so does your God, because this is his model.
So how did they get like, were they born with both a penis and a vagina, or were they
this happens in about 1.7% of people.
Yes,
across
they were
the globe.
born that way.
They're either born with partial organs or fully developed organs of both sexes. Which is why we don't use organs to determine sex unless you're talking about the brain.
So what were the factors that led to that happening would be my question.
Typically it's caused by a hormonal imbalance or a genital defect or a combination of both, or I mean, honestly, sometimes like there's really no single determining factor, because the genes are weird. Sex is weird. Like sexual organs are weird. Well, I'll give you the answer real quick. Is 6 to 7 weeks is when testes start to develop in the abdomen of potential male humans. They don't descend the abdominal cavity until 10 weeks. So up until 10 weeks, you have testes that are starting to develop in your stomach. You don't have balls. So according to the EO, you're not a woman, and you wouldn't be for at least another 10 weeks.
Yeah, and also like your chromosomes aren't even, they're not always, they don't have to always be XX or XY. There's other examples. There's just X. There's
40
XXX.
others.
There's XXY, and there's like 4 dozen different variations of this. But I want to highlight the fact that it really doesn't matter how a person could acquire both a penis and a vagina. The fact is, there are people that have them, and this contradicts your model. So how do you resolve this? I think you have to change the model.
Yeah, and by the way, when we're saying model and when we're talking about this concept, we're saying, like, for instance, all of plastic cups ever made are either red or blue, and I can show you examples of plastic cups that are a different color. Well, this statement that all cups are either red or blue has now been fundamentally proven incorrect, right? And so what we're asking you to do is either understand that your model of stating that these things are either one or the other, if they don't fit your criteria, you need to update that statement, right? Because you said a woman is a person with a vagina, a man is a person with a penis. If a person has both, are they both a man and woman? Which is still a third option, by the way. Like, if that's what you want to call it, so be it. But it's definitely not just a person with a vagina or a person with a penis any longer. And we have about 1% to 1.7% of the population of humans that are some form of what most people call intersex, in which they have partially or fully developed sexual organs of both sexes. And that includes breast, ovaries, vaginas, penises, testes, etc. We're not just talking about a penis and a vagina here. We're also talking about like mammaries and ovaries and fallopian tubes and uteruses and everything else that goes into the sexual organs of males and females. Like
I
there
had
have been
heard of
cases
the
of
phrase
men with fully
intersex.
developed
I had
uteruses.
forgotten what it meant, and I was just looking it up and reading it as we were talking. And yeah, that's that's definitely something that is a part. There are people like that in society. I recognize that. That they deserve all the options and opportunities that any other person would. Obviously, I would hope that those people would be getting some sort of therapy or guidance, but not my decision.
So what do you
but
call
yeah,
those people?
Yeah, that's the question.
The what?
What do you call those people?
I would call them intersex, even though
sex isn't binary. It isn't just male and female.
By having a third option, it can't be binary.
That they are intersex, but there's still an intention and a desire for them to be either male or female.
What do you mean there's an intention and a desire for them? Like, desire by who? Like, what, Christian folk or right-wing folk? Who? What do you mean?
Or even the person?
By God. God allows certain things
God
to happen.
messed up. God's like, he's like making a woman, shit, put a dick on him. Like, I mean, like...
certain things happen that wouldn't happen in a perfect world, but God still desires for, he has a plan for those people, and he wants to meet them where they are.
But like that's sure, but now we have a kind of a problem with saying that sex is binary, because it can't be if there's something else, right? It's kind of like saying you have a light switch, right? And it's either on or off, right? There's no in between. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, also it can dim and change colors. Well, I mean, that's not the same as being an on-off switch, right? Now the light is dimmed, or it's brightened, or it's changed colors, or it turned into a car. That's not the same thing as being on or off.
Correct. It's a product of the fall that
sure, I can grant it's a product of the fall, but will you admit that sex is not binary? If you say this is either male and female or man and woman, you would say that's wrong, right?
It's male or female, but the existence of intersex people is still a real thing, and
so it's my male, hope female,
that they get all the support that they need.
So it's male, female, or intersex.
Except when it's not.
Right.
Like, would we say that? Like, it's always a male or a female or intersex person.
Correct.
That's not binary.
That's not binary. Great. I mean, we're making progress.
It's not, but the intention for gender is still binary. And the creation of people, how God created people to exist is still binary. Intersex people do exist, but that's not in what my belief system would purport for them to be.
Okay, so God had intended something. He got it wrong. He messed up somehow in the fall or whatever. And so God's intentions are one thing, but our models need to map to reality, right? Not to somebody's intentions, whether it God or whoever else. If our models cannot accurately describe reality, wouldn't you say that's a bad model?
But this is where we're never going to agree. God's reality is the reality.
But except it's not, because you said God intended one thing and we have something else. Right? So God's intentions aren't reality, but your model seems to be based on God's intentions, not reality, which means your model is not based on reality.
But God's intention is the reality. It's ultimately what is going to happen.
But it's not.
But by your definition,
didn't you just say
saying
that God's intention was male or female?
And that's ultimately the way it's going to be in the end.
But it's not. But it's not the case now. So in reality, the model fails.
But again, God's reality is the reality. The worldly reality is temporary, and what we have right now is not the way it's ultimately going to be.
Okay, but like
what is
the
God's
temperature
reality?
is temporary. That doesn't mean you base models off of you don't base models off of it. You know what I'm saying? Like things are temporary because things are temporary. That's fine. What I'm saying is like, and what we're trying to point out is that your whole life and everything you do and everything you base anything off of is based on temporary measures, right? Like that's just all of science. That's the way it works. When you get in your car, you're driving to a place that's there temporarily. You're not driving to a place that's going to be there in 10 billion years because you're not going to make it that far. You're doing it based off of a temporary piece of knowledge.
But I actually don't live my life based on temporary piece of knowledge.
James, consider this question.
You do though.
God's intention. God never intentioned cancer, right?
He allowed it to happen as
yes, but that
fall.
wasn't part of he allowed intersex as part of the fall according to your model as well, right? But cancer and interest, those aren't things that God intended, right? Right. Okay. If we had a model that acted as if cancer didn't exist just because God didn't intend it, wouldn't you say that's a bad thing?
It's apples and oranges. Okay.
No. We're saying God did not intend X. If we base a model and insert X, whatever you like, intersex or cancer.
They're two completely different things.
But it's the same model. Remember, this is X. It's just a placeholder. Put whatever you want.
It's not the same. It's not the same model, though.
But here, what I'm talking about is X. The argument is valid, regardless of the what you insert as for the placeholder. I'm talking about X. God does not intend X. If you act as if X does not exist, you're going to say this is the bad model, right?
Right, but again, the discussion on gender and sex is completely different than the discussion on cancer. It's an apples and oranges comparison.
No, it's not an apples and oranges. What I'm talking about is basing your model on God's intentions rather than reality. Because what you're doing right now is your special plea,
right?
Go ahead, Fasad.
God didn't intend for humans to die, right?
He did, actually. It's part of his design for creation.
When he created them perfect in the garden before they ate the apple, he intended that they were going to die?
He intended for everything that has happened in history.
Did he intend for them to murder?
He didn't. There's God's direct and there's his permissive will.
Okay, but did he? This is why I use the word intended over and over, and I'm not going to use any other word because I want to be clear in what I'm asking. Did God intend for people to die? When he created them, he built them or created them with the intention of death. I'm not saying he allowed it because of the circumstances of the fall or that he knew about it. I'm asking, was his intention to allow people to die and to die in the future when he created them? Was that his full intention?
Yes, because he foreknew that humans would act in a certain way.
So he also foreknew that people would be born with penises and vaginas and there should be an intersex.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So he also foreknew that people would be born with both penises and vaginas and there would be an intersex. So God intended for intersex people to exist as well.
But not to ultimately remain that way, no.
I mean, people don't remain alive. What's your point?
Right.
Again, apples and oranges comparison.
No, but
in what way?
What X? So just X. Did God intend X? And then you can say, is your model based on what God intended, or is it based on the reality of X?
But it's not really a model. It's what's in the Bible.
Okay, but what's in the Bible is that God created man perfect to live forever before he ate of the fruit, correct, in the garden?
No, God did not create man to be perfect. He is the only one who is perfect. Even when God created Adam.
So when it says in the Bible that man was without sin and shame, and there was
right, but
There
That's
was
still
no
not
consequences
So that's
to
not
the
perfect.
future.
Sinless. He created man and woman to be sinless.
correct. I agree with that. Yes.
Okay, and so
without
that was
death,
God's intention.
death had not
Yes.
entered the earth.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
And without death, because death had not yet entered the earth.
He did, but he foreknew that death would still come to the earth, and he created man with the
Okay, but he
with the
also
reality
foreknew
that
people would be born with penises and vaginas. We're not going to go down that road about what God foreknows, right? Otherwise, he foreknows everything,
which he
and
does.
that's not a problem.
In my
So it's
belief
not a
system.
problem if God foreknows what's going to happen. It's a problem when he intends for something to happen, right?
Right.
Okay, so God intended people to live sinless in a life eternal in the Garden of Eden. But man, in his folly, ate of the fruit and corrupted himself, and therefore the whole world, and brought death upon humans and the earth.
Right, which he allowed to happen.
Sure, but that wasn't his intention. That wasn't God's intention. It's what he allowed and what he foreknew.
Right, but
so to base any knowledge,
what God allows is also part of his intention because it's part of his plan.
Then everything is his intention.
Yeah, including intersex people and trans people.
My point
there's
is
a difference between God's direct will and his permissive will, and his direct will.
In either case, God wanted something to happen that did not happen, so he either allowed it and foreknew it, or he designed it that way. Is that correct?
He allowed it and he foreknew it.
Okay, that's fine.
Would be my position.
He also allowed and foreknew that people were going to be born intersex.
Yes.
And yet your book doesn't address that. Purpose. Your book doesn't address that in Genesis.
It doesn't, but not everything is literally mapped out in Scripture, right?
Yeah, so maybe we shouldn't take literal instructions from it because, they don't match to what actually happened, right? What actually happened is that death entered the world according to your Bible, or at least according to reality, right? People do die these days. And what we base a model on and what we base science on is that the fact that you and everyone else will eventually die. Because if we based models off of what God's intention was, to live forever in the Garden of Eden, we'd still be living in the Garden of Eden forever. But that's not what happened, right? We'd be basing it off of incorrect and poor knowledge with known assumptions that are false or incorrect because people die now. We know that.
It was always a part of God's plan for people to die. Just because
then it must have always been God's plan for people to be intersex, or it never would have happened.
When we talk about God, we also talk about God's sovereignty. And because God is sovereign over all of these things, nothing comes as a surprise to him. So
God knew there were going to be intersex people. He just didn't mention it in Genesis 1. And now that science has caught up, we have a directive and we have predictions and models that we can use to incorporate those things that God didn't tell you in Genesis 1. Just like God didn't tell you about cancer in Genesis 1. But we know it exists, and we know ways to treat it now. And if we lived like Genesis 1 said, where the cancer wasn't a thing yet, then more people would die of cancer, and you'd say that was a bad thing.
No, I wouldn't say more people die. Or, sorry, tongue-tied. Yeah, of course more people dying of cancer is a bad thing.
Right, because we live on a model based on people not having cancer. That would be an ignorant way to live.
Sorry, can you say that again?
If we lived off the idea that people never got cancer, that would be an ignorant way to live today. Is that correct?
Right, but that discussion is not the same thing as the discussion on intersex and gender.
In what way is it not the
same thing? The problem is the argument works for both. Like it's a valid argument. It logically follows, regardless of what you want to talk about, intersex or cancer or sinless or death or whatever. Because it seems like you accept the structure of the argument, except when it's intersex. Now that's when you have a problem with it. That's called special pleading.
I accept that there are intersex people, but that is not a part
And that means
of
it's not
the,
that means sex isn't binary.
It also means to live like and having a model which only includes male and female is a bad model because it doesn't include those intersex people which you just said exist. It
they
would be
do
like saying
exist, but
cancer
they
doesn't
weren't
exist.
intended to be that way.
But they
It-
do
it's-
exist.
But
So
they do
so the
exist.
model
People
that-
weren't intended to have cancer.
right, and that's what we based our models not based on what God intended, but based on actual reality. Because like, and when I'm walking across the street, I can't be like, oh, you know what? God never intended for me to get hit by a bus, so I'm not going to bother looking. That's not the way. That's not a good way to go about life. I need to be. It needs to be based on reality.
That a
right,
bus
but
might be
but
coming.
the reality is that God created only two genders. Are there still some people who were born with certain characteristics because of the fall? Yes. But that doesn't change the fact that God still, this is the framework that he created for us to live by.
So somebody else created intersex, not God. Somebody else created intersex. So God created male and female, and then somehow somebody else just threw that in. Somehow.
I mean, even by calling it a byproduct
But-
of fall, which I'm happy for you to do, that's fine. It's still like saying God didn't create cancer, so it doesn't exist. You see the problem?
So I'm just trying to understand the connect here. So God,
God didn't intentionally create cancer to kill my grandmother, did he?
no, but God
Okay, but that happened. Like my grandma
has-
died of cancer.
I'm very sorry that happened.
That was 12 years ago. I'm not upset about it. I'm just letting you know the situation, right? In reality, my grandma died of cancer. Okay? So in reality, there's at least, according to you, some gender that is not male or female, intersex gender. That is the reality. Just because your God didn't address it in Genesis 1 doesn't mean it's not the reality. God didn't address cancer in Genesis 1. That doesn't bring my grandma back, right?
Right.
So let's live based on the reality which is impacting people's lives today. The lives in which people have and developed cancer. People which are intersex, which is not binary.
But it's still not a part of the framework for gender that God intended. Does he allow that? Yes, for a certain
It's
purpose.
not the framework for people to have cancer. I'm not arguing what God's intentions or allowments are. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me in any way. What does matter is how we live, right?
But cancer is a disease, whereas intersex is
It's
a person
biological
was born a certain way due to certain characteristics.
Yeah, just like cancer.
That they have.
It's due to the way the cells develop in the body.
I like to give James last word. I gotta get ready to go.
I apologize for cutting mine so short, guys, and I appreciate you keeping up the conversation without me. I apologize for work. I'll talk to you about it later.
Yeah,
Triple A.
I will
just
be forthcoming. I am not an expert on a lot of these things, and as a result, I apologize if my answers weren't forthcoming. I would like to continue this conversation again in the future when I've had a chance to review more studies, because I do find this conversation really interesting. I just, I'm always going to approach things the way I approach things, and I'll always be willing to listen. I think that you can listen and still come to a different conclusion, which is, I'm always willing to listen. Just want to say that.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you coming on, sitting in the hot seat with two non-religious liberals, man.
Yeah, I'm always happy to do it, and I appreciate you guys, and I'm thankful for what you guys do.
I appreciate you, man.
Come on, James.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we're gonna try to stream in more regularly. We got a guest for next week. We'll see you